If you look at next season's jersey, you may have noticed the diamond over the crest, honoring the first women's team to ever play a game in the Camp Nou. A reminder that women's football is continuing to not only set new standards for FC Barcelona, but the club is also making sure to understand both the history of the women's game, being currently written with the two-time Champions League winners, and embrace the club's women's history that was largely pushed aside or forgotten. For this last reason, so we don't forget, today we're talking about Ana María Martínez Sagi, one of the most important, not only women, but people in FC Barcelona history. Martínez Sagi was quite a few things. She was a poet, a journalist, an athlete, and for purpose of this video, the first woman to join FC Barcelona's board of directors. She did come from a club-affiliated family, two of which I've already spoken about through the years. Her father was a Barça executive, and he served as the treasurer of the club from 1917 to 1919. He was thriving in the textile industry at the time, as thanks to men like Antonio Gaudí and Pablo Picasso, Barcelona was being known as a city of culture, especially for the wealthy. Her brother Armando had come up when speaking about Ansu Fati and Lamine Yamal, as he did hold the record for the youngest ever Barca debut. And cousin Emilio, known as Sagi Barba, was one of Barcelona's great legends in the 1920s, and is a prolific goalscorer next to Josep Samitier. The other important figure that you could say for purpose of this story that predates Martínez Sagi, other than her father, was Edelmiro Calveto, who was the first woman to become a Barca member. Her passion for what was happening on the field was rare for women in that era, as they often didn't come to the grounds at all, or if they did, it was merely as a social appearance with their husbands. But Calveto bucked that trend, taking her one-year-old newborn along with her husband and one of his business partners to games, and sometimes being the only woman in the stands at all. Since the statute said that members could only be men, in 1913, Juan Gamper made her a member and updated the statutes to include women as members. This opened the door for Martínez Sagi a few years later, but not that many years later. By the age of 27, and that taking place in the mid-30s, she was on the board of directors, but she didn't last long. That may be her Barca claim to fame, but we're going to get back to that in a little bit. Because I think it's important to talk about what inspired her to want to break new ground and some of the challenges that she faced. Femininity was key to her belief in sports, so obviously she was a big advocate for all of women's sports. She took part in the Women's Sports Club and took part in all of tennis, swimming, track and field. She was a javelin champion, plus rowing and skiing. This was a time when those in higher society connected with the idea of the sportsman or sportswoman almost as an identity. If you remember with the Gamper videos through the years as I try to identify and personify him, being a professional athlete wasn't a thing back then. So being an athlete or being a sportsman was more about how you identified in your hobby. Thriving in athletics was a good representation in society on you as a sportsman. And again, the threshold to play organized sports was usually reserved for students, many of which came from affluent families, or from people that were just from wealthy families. With the idea of a sportsman being so entrenched with identity, it's no surprise that a ton of men feared what a woman in sport would do, because a woman in sport means women's independence. And that upsets the balance and the status quo, something that a lot of those men in high society didn't, and you could argue still don't like much of today. But Ana María was always someone that was willing to upset the order of things. She studied in Spanish and in French because her parents thought that Catalan was for the lower class, so she learned from her nanny. And she began writing at a very early age, getting published at 19. But in that time, due to what was seen as the radical nature of women's writings, most female writers were left-leaning, politically speaking, like Martínez Sagi, but they wrote in Catalan. But she wrote left-leaning articles in Spanish, which does bring up the question, who were those articles for? But instead of not finding any audience, she got some praise from some right-wing critics, including some in Madrid. Her work was recognized, and so she began working for Josep Suñol's paper, La Rambla. And doesn't that name ring a bell? She wrote as a supporter of Catalan autonomy and as a vocal Republican. And for those watching in the US, Republican doesn't mean capital R Republican as in the United States' Democratic Party and Republican parties. No, it was a whole thing about a political identity, and I'm not doing all that here. And because I don't want to even scratch the surface of political identities or anything like that, what you need to know is that she wrote articles that were upsetting to those who didn't believe in autonomy for women, and these articles were not just upsetting to men, but to some women of the time as well. Things got a bit complicated on the home front when her father passed away in 1932. She wasn't on the same page as her mother was very, very conservative in her views. Her mother didn't like that she wrote, played sports, or fought for universal suffrage. She wanted her to instead just find a husband. The story goes that her mother actually wanted another boy and was disappointed that Ana María was a girl. And partner-wise, another important figure enters our story in Elizabeth Mulder. Mulder was an author who wrote against the Women's Sports Club, but she did praise Martínez Sagi's first book of poems. Mulder was married before she turned 18, had a son, and was widowed by 26. She would never remarry. While she would become something of a mentor to Ana Maria, they spent a week together on holiday in 1932, and it left a mark on both women forever. They loved each other deeply, and the pain of never being able to have that happiness again was with Ana Maria forever. Her mother disapproved of it and called it a sinful relationship, but Ana Maria disagreed with that. Mulder, though, conceded that it was the best thing to do to keep their place in society. Around the same time, Josep Sunyol pushed for her to be on the Barça board, and she was accepted unanimously. She was 27 at the time. Her first mission on the board was to create a women's gymnastics section, and she had a lot planned, but it took about a year for her patience to wane thin with the men on the board. They seemed open enough to having a woman on the board, but they weren't open enough to having her actually get to do anything. So again, even though this winds up being her Barça claim to fame, it is not something that she spoke about with any fondness decades and decades after the fact. Now, for those who know their history, you know that the Spanish Civil War was right on the horizon. And there is no way for those who've been with me on these history videos to get around the Spanish Civil War with any of it. It defined the lives of those who lived throughout it. For Martínez Sagi, like so many in Spain in the 20th century, it changed her life forever. She was already a staunch Republican. Remember, it was Republican forces against Franco's forces in the greatest oversimplification in history. And remember, she was also a believer in Catalan autonomy, and she came to believe more in the cause of anarchism. The fighting began, and the anarchists, by violent means, put down an early coup attempt, and she published reports on those events, inspiring her to run towards the war. She was sent back to Barcelona after getting shrapnel in her legs, and that repeated a number of times. Go to war, get sent back. At the time, Elizabeth Mulder, who was a nationalist, was stuck up in her room, and Ana Maria, still with devoutness to Mulder, would bring her supplies. For the remainder of her life, Martínez Sagi kept a bitterness in her heart about their separation, and the hope that they may someday be together again. After the war, she went into exile in France, joining the French resistance during World War II in Paris. In 1942, the Gestapo raided her apartment, but she got free through a window. After moving to Cannes in France, she began selling handkerchiefs before being asked by the wife of the Aga Khan to start to work in interior design. But then after living in Italy and getting the flowers, the perfume industry in 1950 she moved to the US and taught at the University of Illinois. After taking care of US students in France, got that idea in her head about the United States. In 1975, just after the death of General Franco, she moved back to her home of Catalonia. She had been gone for 30 years, but she did live out the remainder of her 25 years back home in the place where it all began. Basically in secret, with only family around to hear her frustrations that she could never regain the recognition with her poetry from the 1930s, as if she had been all but forgotten. But that's the very reason why I wanted to highlight this story, and I'm glad that FC Barcelona has done the same in recent years. Ana Maria Martínez Sagi was a complicated person. Her temper would get her in trouble sometimes, but it was her strong convictions and her passion that propelled her through life. And so often, those people with that kind of passion that we remember the most. Yet, because of who she was in the time she was in, her story of love, of sacrifice, of sport, of war, it would all be forgotten. Today, there are more than 30,000 members of FC Barcelona who are women. And so many culés owe something to Ana Maria Martínez Sagi. If you enjoyed this, please let me know, give it a like, subscribe. As I am kind of pretty honest about this stuff, these videos take a lot of time and don't really get the numbers to help me continue to do this very much more. So if you do like it, I always implore you, make sure that I know about it and let people know. But I do like to make them because for those that are watching here to the very end, I know you have the same kind of passion for this than I do. So again, I'd appreciate if you spread the word. And as always, until next time, Forza Barça.